very quiet last week. Was he okay? I think he's fine. Based on
very well.
So we heard in the letter to the Romans, the Spirit helps us in our weakness, for we do not know how to pray as we ought, but that very Spirit intercedes with groanings too deep for words. We do not know how to pray as we ought. Now on Tuesday of this week, across the railway tracks at St. Joseph's Priory Church, Margot and I attended the funeral for Father Stephen Cooney, brother in the Norbertine Order. It was a privilege to be invited by Brother John to attend, and a genuine blessing to be in the company of a group in the Christian church who have some differences in prayer to what is normal in many Anglican churches. So that experience helped draw my attention to this passage. We do not know how to pray as we ought. Because in all seriousness, I experienced some of the prayer practice at that funeral as genuinely edifying. So I wanted to share some insights from that. The first thing I noticed upon entering was that the space, the physical space, it had a similar presence to our own here. By which I mean, and this is completely unverifiable, is irreducible to data, but particular spaces can have a vibe that falls outside what could be described as neutral territory. And the Priory Church, in my assessment, it had a good vibe, as does our own space here. And watching the people come in, more often than not, they crossed themselves, using water from the font, which, by the way, we are able to do here now, as of a few months ago. So there was a physical, sensorial reminder of their baptism that they did. Also, many people genuflected, that is, bowed on one knee towards the sanctuary and the reserved sacrament before taking their seats. They genuflected. I think if I got into a lunge competition with a Roman Catholic, I would be stuffed. And here's the thing that really got to me. The people kneeled. When it came to the prayers, the intercessions, the people kneeled. They weren't told to kneel, they just went to their knees, went to the ground, mostly using the kneelers on the pews in front of them. But if there wasn't a pew in front of them, as there wasn't for me or the person next to me, they kneeled without support. I think the woman next to me was a woman, she was about 70 or so years old, so she was doing well. I had not kneeled to pray in a long time. I hadn't. But it actually struck me, this is how I ought to pray, at least some of the time. There was like a felt sense that prayer was being magnified, and I could feel more clearly the Spirit groaning within me. So it was a reminder that prayer is not just an interior exercise of the mind and the heart. Our bodies have a role to play. And seriously, on reflection, why would it be otherwise? The accumulated wisdom of the Church of God down the millennia has, from the earliest centuries, provided teaching and guidance in the area of bodily posture for prayer. And Christians these days do pray bodily in different ways. So in Pentecostal churches, it's pretty common to see hands raised as they pray and praise, which I tend to interpret as kind of echoing a traditional Jewish posture for prayer, hands out, which is what we do when presiding at the Lord's table here. Some people put their hands together in pleading. Some open their stance in a receptive fashion. Some cross themselves. Some prostrate themselves on the floor. Some dance to pray. Some walk to pray. Picture of Lego. That's awesome, mate. You should say a prayer of thanks. Some walk, some dance, some garden to pray, and some kneel, particularly on hallowed ground. For the Christmas presents? Yeah. Yeah, say your prayers, mate. Now, one of the people, I'll talk to you after, maybe. One of the people who comes to the Wednesday service every week, a guy named Tom Allen. Beautiful. He shared with me a piece of wisdom that he got from his dad's cousin, a woman named Libby Johnson, who I do trust will get a kick out of her words, finding traction far away from her home in Maryland, USA, and years after her death, while she rejoices with the heavenly host. But she taught him a proverb. You can bend your knees, mate. You do it. Yeah. She taught him a proverb, Libby. She said, sit to listen, stand to praise, kneel to pray. Sit to listen, stand to praise, kneel to pray. I thought it was very clever. And on reflection, thinking back, as a young adult entering the Anglican church tradition in Bigton as it was, the custom I learned from the people around me was to kneel to pray. And that practice of kneeling to pray, it brought to mind a story of a young Jewish woman actually called Etty Hillesum. She was murdered in Auschwitz in 1943. But she left a journal covering the period of 1941 to 43, which is, by all reports from those who have read it, an extraordinary document. And in 1942, she wrote in detail about the physicality of prayer, and particularly the urge to kneel, the compulsion to kneel. She wrote that the urge, and I quote, sometimes pulses through my body, or rather, it is as if my body had been meant and made for the act of kneeling. It has become a gesture embedded in my body, needing to be expressed from time to time. And also, it is really God who hearkens inside of me. The most essential and the deepest in me, hearkening unto the most essential and deepest in the other. God to God. I have to say, this week alone, there were several things which made me want to just fall to my knees in prayer. One, and I hope he doesn't mind me saying, one was hearing from Jack about how very unwell little Everly has been this past week. Thank God for incredible healthcare in this country and this city, seriously. I also wanted to fall to my knees seeing reports in the West Australian news about the shocking increase in family and domestic violence around the country, including several murders very recently. And that spurs me on even more to get things underway with the OpShop project here, so we can divert more resources into that space, however modest it might be. Maybe want to fall to my knees, seeing July of this year, so we're still in July, unfold in the Northern Hemisphere. So independently confirmed by NASA, NOAA, the EU Copernicus Service, the World Meteorological Organization, which gathers data from 180 countries, it was the warmest month on record in human history. with extreme heat events exacerbated by an El Nino event. And then I read in the medical journal titled Nature that last year in Europe alone, there were 70,000 heat-related excess deaths. And that was after a 3-year cooling La Nina event. The 8 warmest years on record, all the last 8 years. So it seems that we could be in for an uncomfortable summer this year, irrespective of whether the El Nino event holds up for us in our part of the world. A lot of things to drive someone to their knees. And remember, Jesus himself, beloved of the Father, Word made flesh, second person of the Holy Trinity among us, prayed on his knees. People came to Jesus and kneeled. St. Peter kneeled to pray. St. Paul kneeled to pray. St. Stephen kneeled to pray, to name just a few occasions in the New Testament. And I've got to clarify, the Bible has plenty of prayer that doesn't involve kneeling. Standing and sitting are fine in spiritual practice, as well as physically necessary for some people. So I'm not suggesting we all be required to kneel. But I do believe there is space to recover the practice a bit in this church here. The statement in Romans holds up. We do not know how to pray as we ought. But your prayer life may be magnified by this prayer posture, and you well may experience the Spirit groaning within you more deeply. From here on, there is a good chance that at the intercessions, the prayers on Sunday, I will kneel to pray. And I just encourage you to consider doing that as well, if you are able. If you feel nervous and uncomfortable about it, I reckon that if a few people do it, it'll be like dominoes and the rest will do it. And then if enough people do it, we might have to, reinvest in pews with kneelers. Some people said yes. Interesting. Isn't that interesting? But the invitation will be made today to kneel or sit at prayer. If you're able, give it a try. The Lord